The power of the Immaterium is something that is rarely understood by the denizens of real space. This is perhaps no surprise. The warp doesn't play by the laws of logic and science defined by reality, with its every structure and appearance seemingly determined by randomness and madness. The other reason for a lack of information on the warp comes from the amount of exposure to it, as most warp-based breaches into reality don't last all that long, and those that do almost universally corrupt those in their wake. However, there are some regions of space where things are a little bit different. Sure, the madness and demonic nightmares are still present, but sometimes the warp is able to breach real space in a given region for an extended period of time, if not almost permanently. Some of these have been around longer than anyone can remember, others have only recently begun to terrorize the galaxy, but for all their variations, they are known under one collective name: warp rifts. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. To begin, let us try to define what exactly a warp rift is and try to standardize how one works theoretically, though mileage does vary. This is the Immaterium after all. A pretty common misconception for those uninitiated in the warp is to assume that a warp storm and a warp rift are the same thing. Even I may have mixed up the two at some point in these logs. The two words have become almost interchangeable. However, there is a fundamental difference between them. It's right there in the names, and I'll give a couple of examples as we go to try and demonstrate that. A warp storm, as you may expect, is, well, a storm that happens within the warp. The Immaterium is hardly a stable thing, and whilst it's rare to know exactly what causes them, it is very common for these instabilities to become major upheavals in a certain region of the warp. For example, during the prelude to the fall of the Eldari and the birth of Slaanesh, much of the warp was in some form of turmoil or another. Warp storms were everywhere, and the period became known to humanity as the Age of Strife. Where people get confused, I think, is the fact that these warp storms have an effect on our lives in the Immaterium too. For example, if a region of warp space is in the middle of a storm, it's nigh impossible to travel through it for mortals. Ships can be thrown wildly off course across all of space-time, and the attentions of the warp's denizens becomes much more of a torment should a ship be trapped or becalmed, unable to break back into reality. It is for this reason that a warp storm will often cut off regions of space beyond or around it from the wider galaxy, as warp travel to and from the region becomes so dangerous as to be unachievable. Those regions are still there, living their lives as best they can, but they're stuck with no way in or out of the system, sector, whatever else you might like to call it. Granted, this does require conceptualizing warp space as some sort of second dimension that can be overlaid onto our own galaxy, but the impossible geography of the Immaterium doesn't really help that visualization. To return to the example of the Age of Strife, this is why humanity was so divided in that period. Every system was isolated from every other due to the density and intensity of warp storms all across the galaxy. When Slaanesh was truly birthed, these storms almost all cleared, leaving the Emperor and his Imperium free to reconquer all of that trapped space. Another famous warp storm that has lasted for many millennia is the one known as the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath, which appeared during the Age of Apostasy to trap and destroy the armies and fleets of Goj Vandaya around Dimmermar. On the other hand, a warp rift is more akin to a crack in reality, a direct gateway between Materium and Immaterium. Sometimes you may hear them referred to as warp breaches, which is another way of looking at it if you prefer to think of the warp breaking into the galaxy instead. The warp rifts are the means by which the Legiones Daemonica are able to appear on any given world, as the demons need some sort of direct connection like a rift to enter real space for any length of time. However, like all things warp-based, they are incredibly inconsistent when it comes to scale, length of time open, and the means for their creation. As I've hinted at or discussed in the past with Demons of the Warp, the amount of time a warp rift can stay open is very random. Some will only be open for a tiny fraction of time, whilst others can stay open for hundreds or thousands of years, and we'll get to some of those examples later. Their size can also vary wildly, and is not necessarily tied to the length of time open, since some huge rifts only last a few days, and other smaller ones can remain hidden almost indefinitely. The size and opening time does typically affect the amount of demons that can enter reality through the rift, though of course there is still a lot of inconsistency there because it's the warp. That's just about the only rule with this thing, consistent inconsistency. The other major variation in warp rifts is how they come to be, as there is also a lot going on there that has some more confusing parallels with warp storms just to make the differentiation a bit more awkward. Some rifts will just appear out of nowhere due to the random nature of the Immaterium, though these ones are likely on the smaller or shorter end of the various scales. Sometimes a mortal will be either the willing or unwilling conduit for demons to enter real space, with their possession acting as a tiny rift or a sacrificial ritual allowing a larger one to be created. Other causes for rifts can include imploding warp drives and similar events that happen more by chance. It's not truly random, there is a known catalyst, but the creation of a rift is more often than not accidental. Even the arrival of a large number of ships in one region or at one point in succession can cause the barrier between the warp and reality to weaken, thus increasing the likelihood of a rift to open. This was most recently seen during the preparations for the Indomitus Crusade, and whilst it might seem odd at a glance, it makes sense when you consider the fact that most ships translate from the warp to real space and thus must open a rift to do so. However, perhaps the most alarming cause for the opening of a warp rift is likely also one of the most common. It is thought that simply the act of war and the resultant large-scale death caused by said war can be enough to wedge a warp rift open. Quite often this happens in conjunction with the actions of cultists preparing the way, or with otherwise desecrated ground, such as on Arthas Moloch during the Tau-Orc conflict there. By using war and bloodshed as the vehicle for entry into reality, this can allow the forces of chaos to turn an impossible war into a rout or even enter as a third party to tip the scales. It is not believed, however, that the act of bloodshed can perpetuate the existence of a warp rift, at least not usually. Once demons enter the Materium, they know they are on a clock, even if they don't know how long they've got, and so they throw themselves into the fray to create as much carnage and madness as possible. It may be that doing so, at least in the case of the desecrated ground style rifts, can help to fuel the rift if the killing takes place in a certain way or at a certain place like Arthas Moloch, but this seems to be the exception rather than a hard fast rule. After all, if mass murder and war could keep a rift open indefinitely, then many would never close again until the war was over, as demons are almost impossible for many species and factions to deal with, and the best way to survive an incursion is often just to wait it out. This would in turn mean far more worlds would have become demon worlds in real space than we believe there actually are. Thus, I find it unlikely that this is how rifts are sustained, if they can be at all. So, now that we have a better idea of what a warp rift actually is, let's have a look at some more legendary ones, and maybe some others too, depending on how we go. Probably to those with a surface knowledge of the rifts, there are three major ones that the majority have heard of. We've discussed the Cicatrix Maledictum at length in a previous log, but there are two others. The smaller and older of these rifts is believed to be the one near to the galactic core in Ultima Segmentum, a Majoris-grade interference known as the Maelstrom. It is unknown when exactly the Maelstrom popped into existence, but it seems to have been around since before any records we have access to began. Some would argue it is more of a warp storm as opposed to a rift, as it is described as a region where warp and reality overlap. I disagree, since you can access the warp using the Maelstrom as far as I understand it, but it's close enough to be either. It's of no surprise that the region in and around the Maelstrom, known as the Maelstrom Zone, is a playground for demons and a home to many forces of chaos. The most infamous inhabitants of the Maelstrom are undoubtedly the Chaos Renegades known as the Red Corsairs, led by Huron Blackheart, who fled into the region following their defeat in the Badab War just a few systems over. Their capital world, New Badab, has become a fortified and prosperous world within the Maelstrom, and the Maelstrom Zone in general could be considered in some ways to be the fringes of Blackheart's domain. The Imperium of Man has never managed to settle in the Maelstrom Zone, and any worlds colonized near to it were always subject to raids and other unnatural phenomena. In fact, before their rebellion, the Astral Claws and their allies were known as the Maelstrom Wardens, a garrison force of several Astartes chapters to try and keep the troubles around the region in as much check as possible. However, if you were feeling like visiting the Maelstrom Zone for yourself, I don't know why you would, but you might, you'd have a little more difficulty these days due to the presence of the Cicatrix Maledictum. It is believed that, like many other warp rifts and other Immaterium-based phenomena, the Maelstrom merged with the Great Rift during its expansion across the galaxy. What consequences this has had on those living in and around the Maelstrom is unknown. Obviously, the Noctis Aeterna was a thing, and may still be a thing for some worlds there, but I'd be interested to see if it had any effect on New Badab and worlds such as that. The next rift up on the size scale is of course the best known warp rift of all time pre-Maledictum, the legendary and infamous Eye of Terror in Segmentum Obscurus. We almost all know the story of how this one came to be. In fact, we already mentioned it. At the end of the Age of Strife, the Eldari's fall was completed as the long gestating Slaanesh was finally truly born. The warp storms that had plagued the galaxy during the Age of Strife were mostly cleared by this event, but at the heart of the Eldari Empire, where the psychic backlash that killed so many originated and spilled into reality, the Eye of Terror was formed. At its heart lies a region known as the Bissos, a direct portal between warp and reality, and the expanse of space around this region is racked with more tumultuous warp storms that can even affect ships that get remotely close to the Eye's edge. The name, incidentally, is believed to have been coined by Perturabo of all people rather than Lorgar, Ingethel the Ascended, or anyone else involved in the original Astartes portrayals. It's a fitting name given what it does, but still, why Perturabo? Either way, the Eye of Terror is very much like the Maelstrom, only cranked up to 11 on the Crazy Chaos scale in terms of intensity and general madness. Even those blessed by chaos are unable to travel safely within the Eye for the most part, often just trusting to chance and the warp to get them to the right place. Said chaos blessed most famously include the now infamous traitor legions of the heretic Astartes, who fled into the Eye following their defeat in the Horus Heresy to escape the Imperium's vengeance. Each of them, pretty much, has claimed some sort of territory within the Eye, with most of said territory being nightmarish demon worlds shaped by their Primarchs and Patrons' will. But the traitor legions are far from alone across the myriad demon worlds of the Eye, as the Rift was a haven for those fleeing the Imperium or wishing to more directly show their devotion to chaos long before that. Doing so inevitably leaves those around the Eye exposed to all the raw, corrupting influence of the Immaterium, something that we're all a bit too familiar with in this post-Maledictum era. And just like the Maelstrom Zone, the worlds around the Eye's rim are more than a little troubled by its presence. Just like the Maelstrom, the Imperium knows it cannot breach the Eye to conquer or settle under its shadow, and instead it seeks to protect the wider galaxy from its denizens and generally hold it back. Short of Sol and perhaps the odd Astartes homeworld, the Cadia system and the wider Cadian Gate was probably the most fortified place in the Imperium, if not the galaxy, one of the only stable corridors out of the Eye and near constantly assailed by chaos as a result. Though the planet and the Gate have now fallen, destroyed in the 13th Black Crusade, they weren't the only obstacles to the denizens of the Eye. 20 chapters known collectively as the Astartes Prices were founded around the borders of the Eye to help protect the galaxy and the Imperium. 2 were lost to annihilation or corruption, and the fate of the rest is a bit up in the air due to the Maledictum and whatnot, but they were there just as the Maelstrom Wardens were too. The Eye is now arguably the northwestern terminus of the Cicatrix Maledictum, which may feed into the idea that the destruction of the Cadian Gate was what caused the Great Rift to spread across the galaxy, but it remains to our knowledge the base of operations for most everything associated with chaos. As previously mentioned, we've already discussed the Maledictum in a previous log, but its creation did lead to more warp instabilities in regions around it. Take, for example, the systems of Rotgrave, Verminox, and Noxias in Ultima Segmentum, right by the other end of the Great Rift to the Eye of Terror, the southeastern one. When the Great Rift came into being, this cluster of systems was caught in Imperium Nihilus and is now ruled over by the plague god Nurgle. You may know the region better though by its new name, the Scourge Stars. It became the launching point for the plague wars into Ultramar, with Mortarion, Kugath, and Typhus all being present in the region at the same time, and to this day I don't think any non-Chaos force has even made a dent into the Plague Father's domains. That's not to say, however, that Nurgle's rule of the stars has gone uncontested. Tzeentch's whispers set Khorne's wrath loose, and now all 4 of the Chaos Gods seek to claim the Scourge Stars for themselves. The all-out war phase, sort of like the great game in reality, has come to an end due to another proposition by Tzeentch, a contest between the greatest champions of each god to settle the claims of ownership. I can't help but wonder why the Architect of Fate made that proposal, but I suspect it's less to do with winning the Scourge Stars and more to distract its rivals. And there you have it, what information we have on Warp Rifts and a bit about Warp Storms too for good measure. Far too common for the liking of anyone not in the service of chaos, these open wounds in reality allow the Immaterium and its inhabitants to spill out, corrupt and destroy. Some only last minutes, others for millennia, but no matter how big they are or how long they last, their danger cannot be denied. For now though, we must move on. Next time, we'll be looking at a near mythical individual, or as it turned out, a group of individuals, the apex of a species that nearly brought the entire Imperium to its knees. Thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.